to you, my screen?
Yeah, we're very clear. I can see it.
Okay. All right. Let's go. Um, so this, we call this landowner deal structure 101. So it's all about empowering you as the landowner. So what's really critical and key here is that the power sits with you, right? Even if you've been approached by a developer, you were approached by a broker, you have the power as the landowner. And as a landowner, you can dictate terms. You can dictate vision. You can dictate how, like, I don't want to sell it. I want to lease it to you. I would like to see this developed. You can only use this portion of my property. You can be an advocate and with the city, where zoning rules can work in your favor. So the picture here is of West Angeles Church in God in Christ, which was the deal that served as an inspiration for me, to see that congregations are not equipped with the knowledge to enter development deals. As I was on the other side of the church in this transaction and felt conflicted, like, man, they're just not prepared. So we're prepared. So we're here. We're going to make sure that you guys are prepared. All right. So first, let's start off. Everyone sort of has their ideas about what deals look like, but we just wanted to highlight, like, what's a bad deal? What's a church deal that goes wrong? So if when you're out there, if someone mentions anything like this, a red flag goes off, right? We want to put, no, this doesn't sound right. So not giving an example of the congregation, but it was, let's say, in South LA, 100% affordable housing, right? So they're doing their mission. They're trying to make a difference in the community. This particular community had a need for seniors, right? Seniors needed affordable housing. Be simple. We'll come back to the definition, but they sold the land, right? So what we're going to empower you to do is that for the same value of selling the land, you can lease the land and retain ownership. You don't have to sell your land to do these projects. Also, there was a land donation to the developer. So they gave the title, right? They sold the land for no money to the developer. They got zero economic consideration, and the church contributed $35,000 to the deal. That's red flags, right? One, because a church should be fairly compensated for their land at fair market value, right? There's always an economic consideration in affordable housing transactions, and you shouldn't be obligated to do a contribution to make the deal work. All right. Second deal, right? So this is in Sacramento. This is market rate housing, right? So the developer approached the church and said, "Hey, we want to help you guys build housing, affordable housing on your property." And then they were like, "Okay, let's do an analysis." The analysis came back and said, affordable housing is not an option. This is in the downtown area where there's tons of multifamily housing. The developer charged the church $185,000 to do this study, and said that if you do not pick them to do the deal, you're going to have to pay us back $185,000 to do this study. You're going to have to sell us your land below appraised value. We're going to give you $1.5 million, but 185,000 of that went back to the developer to pay for that study, and the church had to pay about $500,000 in infrastructure that went to help the project. Right. So at the end, there's a project, and they lost all their parking. That's not on here. Right. They lost their parking for this. It was their parking lot that was connected to their campus. So what I want to empower you guys to know that is not a good deal. Right. That is not fair, and that's not just compensation. But when I told this to the leader of this congregation, he felt like he did not have another option. We even brought another option to the table that said, we can do 100% affordable housing. We can pay you appraised value, which is 2 to 3 times what this value is. We will even pay the $185,000 to that developer to go away on your behalf. And they still said no. This is very real in this space, that developers know, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, that the congregations do not know how to structure these deals. And they will play on your desire to be a good steward and put your land in the deal to make a difference in the community. Right? But if they went to a private individual, they do not transact this way. All right, so just I wanted to highlight the type of land deals that are out there. So just you guys are familiar with, the terms. So one I mentioned briefly was a fee simple sale. That is basically where your property or your buildings is transferred to the developer, right? So you are selling it for some type of consideration. It can be consideration of zero or the right amount. Typically what we, when there is a fee simple sale, you want to receive economic consideration and you want to receive the appraised economic consideration. You will no longer own that land or building, and you will no longer own it. And then on affordable housing deals, which are different than market rate deal, an appraisal determines the value. It's not you saying I want 5 million. It's not them saying I'll give you 300,000. It's a certified appraisal, right? So if you are transacting with anybody in this space, what's the appraised value of your land or buildings? You need to know that before signing anything. All right? You need to know the appraised value. There's nuances to appraisals as well. I won't get into that tonight, but you want to make sure you're getting the appraised value for the highest and best use. What's the myth? So a myth that many congregations have is that, you have to donate your land to the project to make it work. That's a myth. That's the fact is, affordable housing projects typically pay private landowners the appraised land value. That's a fact, right? It's part of the IRS code that goes into these projects with public benefits that it has to be appraised. It's like if you do a highway project and you have to take part of your land to put a sidewalk in, they're going to appraise that and pay you the appraised value for that section of your land that they take for the public project. This is no different, right? So the next type of land deal is a ground lease, which is what we strongly recommend, is where you lease your ground and or buildings to the developer who will rent the land from you and sort of build housing on top of it. In that scenario, you will remain the owner of the land. You will receive appraised compensation for renting that land to them. And then, on these deals, they typically are, 55 to 99 years. And that really has to do about the financing and the affordable housing restrictions to make sure that those units remain at an affordable rent for an extended period of time in exchange for all the public benefit that's invested into the project. Right, so that's, I know a lot of folks are like, why not 55 years? But there's no other way to sort of get back the investment and to make sure folks have a place to stay at a 30% of their rent at the specified income levels. Right. So how are ground leases? Oh, do you have a question, Raymond? No. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I do have a question, but I think I should because I just started taking pictures of this and I
Okay.
probably need to speak with you or Jill about, because we've been approached and some of these red flags you're showing are I mean you've identified as red flags. We I can see them. So anyway, I don't want to distract you, but I'll text you and Jill after.
Okay. Sounds good. And sort of a couple other points I had on here is that your ground lease payments can come in various forms. They can be paid in a lump sum, just like a sale, right? When you sell property, you get a payment. When you do a ground lease, you can get a lump sum. And then sometimes you can get those payments monthly and or annually as well. It really depends on the size, scale of your deal, value of your land. There's many considerations as to sort of how you receive those ground lease payments. And again, just to harp on that same, the point I made earlier, just like a sale, a ground lease is determined by an appraisal. And the appraisal and the value of a ground lease is very similar to the value of selling your property. And it is industry recognized by banks, by investors, by cities. So it's not like it's not what folks do in the business, because I've heard that too. Like, oh, no one ground leases. That's not true. It's very, very common. So the last type of land deal that I want to touch on is a joint venture, because it's brought to my attention that some congregations get approached about joint ventures. And what those are is what's being sought is that we want you to, the developer wants the church to be a partner in the deal, right? Where you contribute your ground, your land, and or your buildings in exchange for an ownership share and participation in project fees and profits, right? You still lease your land to the deal, but all or portion of your payment is exchanged for potential project fees and profits. You may ask, well, why would a developer, what are the reasons behind this? Well, it saves the developer on upfront costs from having to pay you a lump sum, right? It saves them to have to raise that capital. And then when you become a owner, you participate in some of the risk, some of the guarantees, right? So if let's say a $50 million project has a $50 million construction loan, you as owner are now, and your land is now at risk if something goes adverse. And what's a sneaky little thing about affordable, not sneaky, but what most people don't know is it's not like conventional real estate investing where if I put in $1 million, I can expect a 10% return because rents are unlimited on the back end. On affordable, it's usually all publicly financed with some private debt, and you do not generate that type of return, nowhere close to that type of return. Because the whole point is that we're going to pay you fees for doing the project, but we're going to limit the rents so there's not all this cash flow and this high return. So in my opinion, the reason that a congregation would want to be in this type of joint venture is if you're interested in being in the affordable housing business, right? There's congregations that have set up community development corporations for themselves. Right, these are congregations that typically are into, economic empowerment and providing social services for the community, educational services. So this is an extension of the community ministry that they're doing is to provide housing. So a joint venture can help them to partner to learn to build capacity for that community services business that the congregation is running. That's where I could see where a joint venture could make sense, because getting yourself business of affordable housing, building capacity to do projects on your own as a congregation, that could make sense. Outside of that, I don't advise on that at all. And why do I not advise on it? Because it's extremely risky, right? And you don't receive a market rate return on your capital. So hypothetically, if you were getting $3 million for your ground lease and you were looking for a 5% return, right? Which would be $150,000 annually, you would not receive that on the project. Right? Because you can receive $3 million for a 50-unit project, but you're not going to have $150,000 in free cash flow. So you're better putting it in treasury bills, taking your $3 million and put it in treasury bills, let them take the risk. You have your ground lease payment, and you've done good to the community. And you can participate and provide different types of outreach services if you would like to. Right? And why not? Because you're not in the business of running affordable housing, which is a highly sophisticated, institutionalized business, very large business in this country. and you usually have to put your land at risk to do it. So joint venture can be a tool in some rare instances, not advised. So just sort of to wrap this up, sort of the benefit of the ground lease structure, this is the preferred strategy that we recommend. Full economic consideration without selling the land. Your ownership is retained. And it doesn't impact whether the housing gets built or not.
Okay, so
How am I on time, Jill?
I think we have a lot of questions. It's your Q&A time now. If you want to
Can I
close
give
this
them a
down
deal
for
that?
now.
I just wanted to like at least leave them with so they can see some examples of what goes right. So instead of red flags, they can see like green flags. Like, oh,
Okay.
green flags. Okay. So one example that we've worked on is a deal in Inglewood. So ground lease for 65 to 99 years. That congregation will receive a lump sum ground lease payment of 6.2 million. $2 million is the value of the land, and 4 million is the value of the buildings that are being adapted for housing. 60 units that are addressing the needs in that neighborhood with a lot of at-risk seniors and a lot of low-income workers that are supporting the new arenas that are being built in the explosion in downtown Inglewood. The church remains on site. The developer has been selected and construction slated for later this year. All right, so that's an example of mission, ground lease, fair economic consideration, and even the church got to decide who was served, like who's being served, what populations from the community are being served. And there's one other example is a congregation in Laguna Beach. Again, ground lease for 65 to 99 years. They're estimated
I said you have a strawberry milkshake. You don't have any orange stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Putting it in the kitchen because I don't want it to knock over.
Thank you.
And so,
So just
Oh.
another, just another example of a deal that we've negotiated, ground lease, an estimated payment because it's still in the appraisal hasn't been finalized yet, but we're able to, that's the actual floor that the congregation will receive. It's targeting seniors and low-income workers. A church remains on site, and it's still, it's in the actual, we're trying to finalize the MOU and get to the option to ground lease phase. So again, another example that followed the previous example in a deal that we were involved in, and so to put the church in the position to benefit both socially and economically.
Great. So, Andre, I'm sure people have lots of questions for you. If you want to close this down so we can see each other, and then we'll start having a Q&A time. I think I already saw one from Roseland, but there's probably others too that want to have questions. Let me see what's in the chat. Roseland, do you want to give your question?
Yes. The slide right before you asked, was there any questions, said that it didn't matter whether or not you ended up having the building put on it. That's a little confusing. So then you're saying that you can lease the land to the city or county, but you don't have to build? Seems like that would be.
That was more about, sorry, not misworded, but it's more saying like you'll be told that housing won't be built if you lease your land, and that's just not true.
Does that make sense, Roseland? That some people have said that housing won't be built.
Restate that again. You're saying housing will not be built just because you lease your land?
No, like folks will say that you won't be able to build housing on affordable housing on it if you lease your land.
Oh,
Say
okay.
that, but that's
That-
not
yeah.
true. He's trying to dispel a myth.
okay,
The myth
Okay.
is that when they say you're gonna do a ground lease, that they may come back and say, well, then we can't do it, you know, but that's just not true, because ground leases are common, they're done all the time. And so they're just trying to negotiate with you. And so unless you understand that ground leases are common and it's something you should ask for, and that of course they can still build, but it's just, it could be a developer that's not really that good of a developer, and they're trying to take advantage of you. So that we're just trying to equip you in the process in advance, and we'll be there with you when those questions happen. You know, you're not going to be alone in this process, but yeah, but it's a good question. Other questions for clarifications and anything that Andre said? He said a whole lot about the deal and how it's structured. And
What- Yes, I have a question, Jill.
yeah,
What happens after the 55 years or 65 years, Andre?
It reverts back to the landowner. But typically what happens is they're going to try to negotiate to extend the lease.
yeah. But there are situations where the landowner has been able to purchase that, and they become the owner of that improvement, of that development. Yeah. Good question.
So to clarify that question and the response, so you go through a 55 or 99-year lease,
Mhm.
and the structure has been built. And if you're not able to renegotiate it, you would have the responsibility or the obligation to buy out the value of the building?
No,
It gets
I think
reverted.
she was mixing a couple of things. So yeah, no, it gets the improvements go back. There's just, she's mentioning there's options that the ground lease, like during the term of the ground lease, there have been congregations that have like bought the building, bought the improvements before the end of the ground lease from the developer group.
Okay.
Hey, Jill, that's what you're referring to?
Was that your question, Raymond?
Well, I just, when the lease has run its course,
Mm-hmm.
and does the church or the landowner have the option to take full possession
Mm-hmm.
of their land and building?
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Yes.
asking. I mean, not that I plan on being around in 99 years. We're not certain about that one, but just to make certain, when you're presenting something or sharing with individuals, you've kind of dotted all your I's and crossed your T's from that perspective. So. Yeah.
So the idea then, the question you have is, can that be negotiated? That's your question, right?
Right.
By the landowner. And your answer, Andre, is yes, right? That's always comes to the point where it can be negotiated. But typically the developer is the one that would continue if you want, but there's a choice there, right?
Right.
Well, it's our understanding that if you negotiate a reversion clause from the very beginning, once the lease period ends, all the improvements go back to the landowner with no cost.
And no competent attorney would not put the reversion clause in there.
Yeah, so all of the improvements, let's say all the housing units go back to the congregation at no cost.
Yeah.
At the end of, if it's not renegotiated at the end of the lease term, it goes back, which, we think could be a huge benefit to congregations.
To become the owners.
To have control over all the units, to own and operate all those units. I think Al had his hand up or finger up.
Andre, there were a couple of acronyms that you used on your last slide. Could you explain those? I think it was LOA, MOI, something like that.
Oh, LOI, yes, it's a letter of intent. So typically, you know, once you select a developer partner, they would either provide an LOI, which is a letter of intent, or a memorandum of understanding that sort of memorializes the structure of the transaction and all of the business terms that at that point can be, you know, that are known, right? So you may not know the number of units. You may know like it's going to be appraised value. You have an approximation on lease, how much time you're going to give them to study the property. You know, like what portion of land or buildings will be designated for the housing.
Okay.
So,
Let's see here.
I had it.
So I'm gonna have, let me see if I can know how this works. With Susan, I think you're Susan. Do you mind muting? Can you do that? Do you know how to do that? That's all right. Thank you. Appreciate that. So there was a question that someone wanted to ask in regard to right of first refusal. And so how does that work? I think that's typically with individual units, right? Or is that also related to?
It's,
Yeah,
it's
I
related.
think we answered that because the idea is once the lease expires, all the units, the housing units go back to the church.
Mhm.
That person may know a little bit about the tax credit process, and
Mhm.
sort of in the tax credit process, there is a right of first refusal for a qualified nonprofit per section 42 of the IRS. That's an option that's in every like tax credit partnership agreement. So if the congregation is interested in being in the business of affordable housing, then you can tell the developer that you would like that right put into their partnership agreement. Just the option to after 15 years that you could just buy, you could buy the improvements. So you don't have to wait for it to revert back.
Yeah, and that's called resyndication, if I'm not mistaken. And every 15 years, you have new tax credit investors. And at that point, the church or congregation could theoretically purchase the housing units. But you would need a lot of money, right, Andre?
No, it depends. No, not necessarily, because it's the appraised value minus the value of outstanding debt, which is perm debt and soft debt. So what happens sometimes in projects of like cities, so I'm working with a client in San Francisco where the appraised value is $10 million, a nonprofit looking to acquire it from a larger nonprofit. But with the city debt and the perm debt, it's actually $8.7 million of debt. So the actual price that they would be buying those 49 senior units for would be $1.3 million. So it really depends on how much soft financing and things like that are in the project. If you choose to elect as a nonprofit under that rule,
There's going to be probably a whole lot more questions you might have for Andre. Feel free to put those in chat. We're getting pretty technical. Our first two sessions were not near as technical as this session. And so no question is a bad question.
no.
And so feel free to put your questions in chat for Andre. We're going to take just a few minute break, only 5 minutes. We've been going now for an hour. And so we always need a little bathroom break. And so I want you to come back in 5 minutes and no more. We're going to start right in 5 minutes. We're going to have a little quiz for you. And so we'll see how you did in thinking this through, it might even raise more questions that Andre, but we really appreciate Andre and his amazing expertise that he provides to our team. And so, so enjoy your break. 5 minutes. Thanks. Let's see here. I think that the church in Claremont gets the prize for bringing the most folks today. You guys are amazing. Got such a great contingency of folks that are showing up. It's and you're asking great questions, so thank you. And Al, it's good to see you. I mean, it's so encouraging to hear about the groups down in your area.
Jill,
Yes.
I have a couple new persons here with me today.
Okay, so you've got
You see Anton?
Anton Boyd.
No,
Oh,
it's
Anton.
Brian Boyd
Oh, Brian Boyd
and then Anton.
and Anton. Well, thank you both for joining us. So
Really
I met
excited to have him as a part of our team. So,
Yeah, yeah. Thank
okay.
you,
All right.
Anton. Thank you, Anton. I'm glad you're here. I didn't get to learn much about you yet, but I've heard a little bit about Brian and how amazing you are. So thank you for making time today to learn more about our effort, what we're doing. So we're pretty much done with our time here. So we're gonna jump right in with a little quiz and see how you're doing. So Maura and Phil, you guys are both up. And
All right.
I'd like for
Yeah.
you guys both to just introduce yourself a little bit more detail. I read before what we have on our website about about Andre, but I realize it's a little dated. So if you guys could just bring us up to date when each of you introduce yourself, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Phil Burns. I'm chair of the committee, and I am also the planning lead. So we look at everything zoning, everything related to kind of facilitation, community, the city, that sort of thing, and also work with Maura on the design of projects. So I'm an urban planner by training. I run a planning and urban design firm called the Arroyo Group that has done work in many of the same communities that you all represent with local government. So we understand that side of it, but as a person of faith, really want to serve the church in doing these projects. So that's me, Maura.
Yeah, I'm Maura Chen. I work with LA Voice. I'm an architectural designer. So I'm working on the designs and drawings, models, and feasibility studies for all of your sites and any of the sites of congregations that we're working with. So that's my role.
Great. And do you want to go ahead and share screen? That'd be great.
Okay, do you have all your updates for parking in there?
No, but we're going to do parking afterwards. So,
Okay.
yeah. So what we're going to do right now is a little quiz to see if you're paying attention during the last two sessions. Andre's presentation that he just got through, and then also the ones that Maura and I did last week. So we're going to start it off with some softballs, and then we're going to get it into a little bit harder steps. So I'll do the first one. A church needs to donate its land to the project for it to be affordable. Church needs to donate its land to the affordable housing developer in order for the project to be affordable. Who knows the answer? True or false?
That's false.
False. Very good. All right. Excellent.
Nice work. Oh, did you want to do this one?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so ground leases pay much less than selling the land. Can anyone tell me if it's true or false?
also can be false.
Yeah, that's false. Very good.
At least in affordable housing context.
Mhm.
All right, now we're going to step it up a little bit here with our questions from session 2 from last session. So started
Gotta
off.
test your memory a little more.
Yes, absolutely. So the bungalow court, Maura gave us some examples of bungalow courts. Bungalow court addresses a missing middle housing type, and that it provides low-slung buildings that house individuals or couples while maintaining a higher density than is typically possible in residential zoning. Is that true or false?
I'll say true in Belgium.
In Belgium.
I visited one of those bungalow courts and they said their density was higher than a 3-story building. That's what they said.
It can be. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot of 3-story apartment buildings, and Palm Springs, right? And they're not necessarily high density. So, yeah, that's right. You'll get higher density than single family zoning for sure. Okay. On to you, Mel.
Designing a flex space proposes that a congregation could possibly use one room interchangeably as A, a fellowship hall, B, space for community events, C, site for mutual aid food distribution, or D, any of the above.
All the above.
All of the above.
Yeah, everyone
good.
remembers talking about this concept? Cool, great.
Yeah.
Okay, question 3, tax credit affordable housing developments, which is basically what Andre's been talking about today, are usually for what size of project? 10 to 25 units, 25 to 50, 50 to 150, or over 100? See, all right, Martha, very good. We got some people paying attention. Excellent. So I did know, I did mention for those of you who may not be able to get to 50 units on your property, the deal may look a little bit different. So if you have questions about that, contact Andre or ask him during his next Q&A session.
Okay, last one. All of the following can be forms of affordable housing except permanent supportive housing, affordable home ownership, market rate housing, or senior housing.
Good job, Rosalind.
All right.
Market.
Great work, everyone.
Well, thank you for giving your attention to our time, and we want to move on here, and I want to mention that we're going to have Andre come back and talk a little bit more with us about what the actual deal looks like. So we talked about the ownership structure could either be a joint venture, which we don't really recommend in most cases. It's too much of a risk for the church, and you're not going to get as much out of the deal. And then also the long-term ground lease, or outright selling the land, which we encourage churches not to sell their land. And so so we've talked about that. Now he's going to look at how does this money come together? How does that, what's the capital stack and the financing? How does this actually happen? So Andre, thank you for helping us out here.
All right. So let's dive right into sort of how affordable housing projects get financed. Can you guys see my screen clear? We good? Yeah. Is it? All right. So the primary way that affordable housing is financed at a very high level, there's private resources. It's a combination of private resources, public resources, land donations, and what I call private grants and donations. Right. So every project is a combination of this. There's no like exact way to do it. Right. All right, so let's break that down a little bit. So what are like the private resources that could go into an affordable housing project? Well, the main source of private financing in a affordable housing deal is there's a construction loan, right? Pretty straightforward there. There's a permanent mortgage. So just like a residential real estate, there's a mortgage. The developer from time to time can contribute equity into the project, and then an investor can provides equity. In the affordable housing world, the form of equity that typically an investor provides that is private, it's called low-income housing tax credits. I left out the housing. But that's the primary investor equity for an affordable housing project, is low-income housing tax credits. The tax credit is provided by the IRS and the developer, then it privately sells it to different classes of investors. So you have banks, insurance companies, and what's called syndicators are the primary buyers of low-income housing tax credit equity. So those are the private resources that typically go into an affordable housing project. Public resources that go, they're city county funds, right? And that typically comes in the form of a grant from the city, a loan from the city, and or a land contribution from the city or county. So I tried to break it at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level, right? So for state, so at the state level, which I'm using California as the example, it's similar. State of California provides affordable housing projects with grants, loans, and surplus land that they may have. And HDC is the sort of main California agency that grants this fund, grants these funds. And the last part of public resources that go into the project is on the federal side, right? So HUD is the main federal agency, is the federal housing agency, and HUD also provides grants and loans into projects. And one additional thing that HUD provides is they provide housing vouchers, right? So that is a public resource that HUD distributes through the state and or city or county to individuals and to projects. So you could have a project that we just talked about that could have a construction loan that's private, a tax credit equity that's private. The city donates the land and they get a grant from the California HDC or a loan from California HDC and have housing vouchers from HUD. That can all happen in the same project. The next thing I would talk about is just a land donation. So land donation in the terms of financing, it's considered like you can put the value of that land donation as a part of your capital stack, right? And land comes from, as I mentioned previously, city, county, state, right? Parking lots, surplus land, buildings. Public and private institutions also donate land to affordable housing projects. Like you'll see the college campuses, you'll see businesses that have a part of their campus that they'll allocate, that they'll donate for affordable housing. One example of a business that's doing that is Google and Apple, right? So their campuses in the Bay Area, they are actually allocating land on their campus for affordable housing. And then lastly, just private individuals who just want to make a donation of their land and or buildings for affordable housing. And sort of the last bucket of funding that goes into affordable housing are just private grants and donations. So, foundations can invest money or grant money into projects. Individuals and organizations can provide money to help with financing projects. And then, sorry, I forgot to take the federal funds off this slide. Please ignore that as I was making my slides. And then sort of just wanted to give you like a real life example of sort of what a project financing looks like. So a project is usually breaking into two buckets. You have construction sources and permanent sources. And on this particular project, right, we have a $20 million construction loan, right, that's private, or in this case, it's tax exempt, which is it's public-private. It's a public issuance, but it's bought by a private business. You have federal tax credit equity. In some instances, the state of California also provides their own tax credit equity, so that can be a source. MOHCD is the city of San Francisco's vehicle to invest money in the deal, but this is a grant from the city of San Francisco. Sorry, a loan from the city of San Francisco for $10 million. And then sometimes developers can pledge a part of their fee and put that in the project. So that's the top part of the sources that it takes to build it. And then sort of once the project's completed and you go into sort of the permanent part of the project, you'll see that the permanent loan, which is also the mortgage, is 729,000. More equity comes in, tax credit equity of 22 million that pays off the construction loan. And then the city of San Francisco still keeps their $10.9 million loan into the project.
It's really clear, Andre, at least for me. Others might have questions. But
So that, I
usually
mean,
there's
that-
more, sometimes there's a bunch of funding sources, right? Not just this. This is pretty simple.
right, like, yeah, sometimes there's let's see, I think I have an example right here of one that's
Like
can-
cap
I
and
can share-
trade.
yeah, I can share, hold on, I'll pull up a budget from a project I'm working on now and show you. This one has, I think, 15 or 16, some crazy amount of sources. Okay, where is it? All right, can you guys, is my screen showing this new budget?
You need to make it a little bigger so we can see it.
You guys can see it?
Move it to the left. It's
Left?
kind of, yeah, move it around a little bit. Yeah, that direction. Perfect.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So
So
this is a project that I'm advising on, and sort of the top is the permanent, the bottom is the construction. And if you look, you'll see there's a permanent loan, there's a ground lease loan, there's deferred interest, there's a gap loan, there's a state GP loan, there's operating cash flow that goes into it, there's deferred developer fee. So this one has, like, I think this is 8 sources, right?
Wow.
8 sources of public and private financing. So you have a housing authority, you have the state program, HCD, you have private mortgage, you have private tax credit investor, and you have developer contribution, and you have operating cash flow from the budget to help pay for this project.
aren't you glad that you're not a developer having to pull all this together? Thank you, Andre, for all this hard work. Yeah. So I'm sure you have questions for Andre on all these different layers of funding that go into a project and kind of what they mean. And how this
Sorry, I
deal.
put HCD, not, I meant HCD, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. So what are some questions you all have for Andre? Or for any of us or comments?
I saw our housing vouchers, Section 8 vouchers. Yes, that is a form of housing voucher, but they're more, Section 8 is what's commonly known by most people, but there are various types of vouchers that extend beyond Section 8.
Usually cities, there's different ways of determining what percentage of those vouchers can be set aside to actually use. They're called project-based vouchers, and they can be used for the construction of the actual housing. There's the type of voucher someone can get, they take with them, and they try to find a landlord willing to take their voucher. But then there's the type that goes right into the deal and the project itself. And so I think in our city right now, 40%, it's pretty high. 40% of those vouchers can be used for projects. But isn't it a little different for every city, Andre? And then
Some
the number of
cities,
units.
some cities may not have vouchers. Sometimes, I know, like, for example, the state of Massachusetts, when I was working there, they had a state voucher program that was not Section 8. It was called the MRVP. So it was a state voucher program. There's vouchers that are associated with veterans that are not considered Section 8 vouchers. There's the vouchers that go along with homeless households that are not Section 8 vouchers. So there's so many different types of, there's probably, I would say, 10 maybe in the state of California that'll be used. But Section 8 is definitely the largest
Mhm.
and
Most known.
most commonly known. Yeah.
Here's a test question. So,
Now, there's a great question here Susan has about taxes. Is that what you're going to say, Susan, right now? Was that you, Susan, that was speaking? I interrupted. Sorry.
That wasn't me speaking, sorry, but that was Ed's question.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Do you see the question about taxes, Andre?
Yeah, so tax credits and property taxes are not one and the same. So like the property taxes are issued by the county. But in a ground lease scenario, the taxation for that ground lease would be paid by by the developer. And oftentimes the developer will apply for a property tax exemption since they're providing units at below market rents. The tax credits are something that are separate. So the tax credits are issued by the IRS and is issued to the developer. And then the developer is able to go out and sell the tax credits, which are dollar for dollar on a corporation or individual's tax return. So that only applies to the purchaser of the tax credit and the developer. So the church there would be no tax implication for the church, either tax credit or property tax implication.
Yeah, all these different tax abatements are really important to help projects pencil. And so there's one that's featured in my book, Making Housing Happen, where a church in Atlanta, it wasn't a church, but a group of leaders, church leaders, was able to get a prison and adaptively reuse that into affordable housing. And because of their tax abatement, it was an older building, clear back from the 1800s. And so to pay all those back taxes, it would have been prohibitively expensive. And so because they got a tax abatement, it made it possible for them to do the deal and make it long-term affordable. So all different ways to help cut the cost and make it work. Other questions for Andre? I'm looking in chat to see if I see anything. We've asked some good questions. If you have more, don't hesitate. We want to now talk a little bit about parking, and but I do want to mention briefly about housing for those with disabilities. That's a new funding source that is coming available here in the state of California. I think it's been in other states for a while, but through the regional centers, we're able to get several, get $1 million at least for a number of units to help go into the deal. And so if that's something that some of you are interested in, supplying a percentage of those units for people with developmental or intellectual disabilities, there's also funding for that. So, so Phil, I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about parking. Are you ready for that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, everybody's favorite topic, parking.
Parking.
I start this off by how parking explains the world. Can you guys see that? You can see that? Okay. Yeah, I put that because there's actually on NPR this week, I saw that was the title of one of their stories that was on the podcast entitled How Parking Explains the World. And it's actually, if you want to take a deep dive into urban planning, you will find that parking is actually kind of behind everything, all kinds of decisions, and affects so many outcomes that we have socially, economically, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody wants more parking, right? Who doesn't want more parking? Who doesn't want easy parking? Well, here's an example of what happens when we prioritize parking. over other considerations. This is downtown Denver in 1926. Vibrant area. Soon, look at all those buildings going on. This is the same place in 1976. Yikes. There's plenty of places to park, but there's nowhere you'd want to go to. Right? So parking is not an unambiguous good. The environmental impacts of driving are, well known, but maybe not to everybody. Here you can see the, in tailpipe emissions, in health impacts from brake dust, from so many other things that vehicles do to, increase greenhouse gases and global warming, give us smog, obviously, and affect our health. And unfortunately, as we transition into electric vehicles, although the tailpipe emissions are much less, right? They're almost nothing, right? For electric vehicles, as opposed to gas vehicles, the overall carbon footprint of electric vehicles is actually only about a quarter less than a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. So it's not really that great for the environment, not compared to taking public transit, walking, biking, which of course much cleaner. And then as we look at how does parking affect housing as well? Well, Maura will not let me won't let me lie here. As we start to design housing, the truth of the matter is that we start to design parking lots. And then after we design the parking lot, then we design the building, because parking controls everything. So here you see an example of a site where somebody said, hey, we need to have 2 parking spaces, or a city said, we need to have 2 parking spaces for every housing unit. Well, you've only got so much land. You're going to put 2 parking spaces for every unit there. You're actually only going to be able to get 8 townhomes on that plot of land. You've got to divide the land cost only into 8 households. So each of those is going to cost way more, $730,000, versus a site where there's no parking requirements. And we can just build whatever we need, right? It allows for the land to be much better utilized and the prices to be much less. So how much parking to provide? The parking requirements are generally set by cities, right? And so if we're talking about one of these developments, there's going to be congregational, religious assembly use, what they say, parking requirements. That might be, you have to have 1 parking space for every 6 feet of pews, 6 linear feet of pews. That is actually generally how they're set up. And then on top of that, you have to have parking for residents. Okay, so that's where we were, status quo, up until 2020, actually. But it's vastly changed since then. So AB 1851, approved by the state of California in 2020, reduces parking requirements on religious congregation housing developments. Crucially, it allows congregational and residential parking requirements to be counted together. Okay. And then AB 2097, just this past year, 2022, actually eliminates all parking requirements within half a mile of major public transit stops. Okay. So what is the bottom line of all this? Well, a lot of these requirements, right, are now much diminished. And, we will navigate with you all the particulars of it, because it's different for every single site, how these actually play out. But to a large extent, which was not possible before, now congregations have the freedom to choose how much parking they want on site. Again, there's no prohibition on providing parking. You can provide as much parking as you want, but it's up to you how much you want, at least for yourself as a religious congregation that's going to continue to operate. You might have to deal with some requirement for residents, but that will depend. Okay, so in thinking about how much parking you want to have on site, we're talking about this because so many affordable housing deals on church land we've tried to do have been killed by the congregation saying, no, we need to have X number of parking spaces, non-negotiable. And it turns out that when they're going to take a lot of their land, a lot of their current parking lot, and develop it, there actually isn't, the project is not feasible anymore with that amount of parking dedicated to the congregation. So what, how much does it cost to build parking? Okay. New surface parking lot might cost $4,000 a space. New structured parking space, $40,000 to $50,000. New subterranean parking space, $60,000 to $80,000. I'm giving you numbers all based on prevailing wage, which is what we have to use for affordable housing. It's a little bit cheaper for market rate housing, but so you can see in this example over here on the left, right? This is an example of a congregation's wish list. Well, the things they want to get in the new development, right? They're going to build housing, but they also want new church spaces in that housing, as Maura was talking about. They also want new parking in that building, okay? And you can see how the costs start to really mount. Now, luckily, this is a church that has a lot of land in a good location. They actually, their ground lease is going to be bigger than this. They can spend all this money if they want. But you can see at $50,000 per space, that's a big chunk of change to invest in parking. So which of these two pictures costs more to build? The Beamer or the Honda Accord inside a parking garage? The Honda Accord costs more. So what alternatives do you have? Okay, considering these costs, we really want to encourage churches to think about alternatives to just building, just replacing the parking that you have on site with a big garage, with tons of reserved spaces for yourself. It might be that those spaces are only used a couple hours a week. And is that really a good use of God's resources? Is it really a good use of your resources that might better be invested in programming? We encourage, think about certainly encouraging people to not drive, right? To walk, to bike, to come to church in a different way. Consider on-street parking. Do you have on-street parking available? Is the public parking available? Can you lease parking for Sunday mornings from someplace else? This is what my church did. My church redeveloped a large piece of land. And the deal was progressing that this was about 10 years ago. They were going to invest $300,000 in the new development that was being built for the church to have about 10 to 12 reserved parking spaces on the bottom floor of a subterranean parking garage. So people would have to drive all the way down there, go up the elevator and get to church, 10 to 12 people. They realized that with that same $300,000, they could put that money into an investment account. And the amount of money that they would make off that investment account would actually pay to lease a parking lot of an office building across the street, which was not being used on Sunday mornings, right? Not very much anyway. And that would pay for the entire congregation to be able to park across the street at the office building. So think about these kinds of creative things. And one of the questions that is on your intake form is how many parking spaces do you need? And how can they be accommodated? Right. Great. So I think that's all. And I'll take any questions if there are any questions about this topic.
This is one of those super sensitive topics.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, Al, go ahead.
Andre, this isn't directly related to your presentation, but say something about building on top of a lane of parking instead of avoiding using that airspace, build over it.
Yeah. Sorry, was that to you, Andre? Go ahead, if you like.
You can grab it.
Certainly, you can build on top, and that is what most congregations do. Okay, but it's going to be at that structured parking cost, right? So the ground floor of the building is going to be a parking garage, and then the housing is going to go above. Church,
There's
would you-
also platform. That's what is it called? Is it not platform?
Podium.
Podium.
So
Podium
yeah, that's
parking.
what I'm describing. Podium.
Podium parking. Mhm.
Mhm.
I think right sizing parking
So
lots.
is that when the ground floor under the building is parking? Is that what you're calling the podium?
Yes.
Okay, I know we want to minimize the costs, but then there's a need to provide parking for residents, and it's how do you balance that, because in most neighborhoods, the on the street parking is very limited.
Mhm.
So
You're right, it is a balance. And what we are, as we work with each congregation, we're going to talk about those pushes and pulls. What we're most concerned about at this point is the amount of parking that the church wants to be available for church use. The parking that would be provided for residents is going to be part of the affordable housing development's cost and will be paid for by the developer, right? However, any parking that is reserved for use of the church will have to be paid for by the church. So that's really the key question here. And you're right. I mean, we're not suggesting that make it impossible for people to come, right? I mean, you don't want that, right? That's not what this is about. But it is about thinking about how we best use our land resources and our financial resources.
Yeah, it's everybody wants our churches to grow, and that's the key, and hopefully through the affordable housing, there'll be opportunities to share the love of Christ and see more people, as we reach out to new neighbors. And but just think they live right next door, and so just the whole idea of right sizing parking lots according to the current needs. And right now we have churches that are struggling, and they have parking lots oftentimes that are way too large for their current needs. So you have to really find that balance. And that's where, all these decisions aren't going to be made today. These are all things we're raising just so you can be thinking about it. And then as you fill out these in your intake form and start thinking through what your real needs are, all this comes together to create a project that's going to work for everybody with lots of back and forth negotiating until it's something that everyone, including your city and your neighbors and you and your church and your needs are all going to be met best you can, you know. So yeah. Are there other things, Andre, that you might add about parking with some of the deals you've done and some of the creative ways that churches or other organizations have addressed the parking
Yeah,
needs?
I mean, there's like the shared use, right, where the congregation isn't really active on the site. Kind of the apartment uses it the majority of the time, and maybe there's a couple spaces that are designated during the week on certain days, on the weekend, and then a time like on Sundays, like 8 to 5, there's certain number of spaces. So you still get the use of the space, and you don't have to pay for the parking arrangement. Other solutions have been targeting populations that don't require a lot of parking, right? So there's some, like seniors typically have a different parking ratio, so there's less stress on a site for parking. Or initially it was thought of that the at-risk homeless population did need parking, but as they get established on their feet, are able to, some of them are able to obtain cars, so then they need a place to park. That's there's been deals where we looked at like this, like the city potentially paying for parking spaces, right? So outside of like the church's need for those hours, the city has spaces that can be used to the public, and that's a way to sort of offset the burden impact on the congregation, because parking is expensive.
Thanks, Andre. Every type of housing has a different parking requirement. So you're not going to be required to do a lot of parking for the residents with permanent supportive housing, which is, for those chronically homeless. And then for senior housing, the parking requirements are more limited as well. But when you come to single family homes, there's more parking requirements. So every type of housing is going to have its own requirement. And so you might speak to that a little bit. There's also some really good questions in chat. If either you, Andre, or Phil could answer those, please.
Yeah, it was just, I guess to talk about the different, requirements for different types of housing. Yeah, it's gonna be much less, there's gonna be much less parking required for residents when we're talking about senior or special needs, permanent supportive housing development. Those can be built with a lot less parking. In the case of permanent supportive housing, no parking is required, although, and as Andre said, it may be desirable, to have some parking. But it will affect the, you sort of do it as you design the project to figure out what can be accommodated without killing the feasibility of the project. If you're talking about a family project, that's probably going to require a little bit more parking in it.
So the question that's in chat, it says, do you find that there's an issue between church parking if the church elects to severely limit the number of parking spaces plus street parking, and then residential parking needs? What about the conflicts with neighborhoods and single family units? So this is where in our last session, we talked about something called asset-based or asset mapping. And so as you build relationships with the businesses and the residents and the different entities that are around your church, you may be surprised at the assets. You might be surprised at the opportunities in one congregation or one organization that may have all kinds of excess parking that's just sitting there. And so in those relationships you build, it could change everything and the feasibility of the project. So, but what were you going to say, Phil, in answer to that question?
No, that's great. That's a great. I mean, not trying to say that none of these things will be issues. You know, it can be an issue. It can be, you know, a lot of it is cultural. You know, is it a culture?
Well, here in Houston, in the case of my church, we built a very nice parking lot, but it doesn't accommodate us. So we rent space from the University of Houston is on one side of us and Texas Southern is on the other side of us. So we rent their parking lots on Sundays to help accommodate our parking. And that's worked out very well for us until the Final Four. For the Final Four, they didn't rent us the parking that Sunday. It was terrible. So
Figure out how to share cars to get there. Yeah.
How
no,
many spaces are you talking about are needed on every Sunday?
Oh, that we're using at the colleges?
Yes.
I would probably say at the University of Houston, we probably use 300 or 400, and then at TSU, maybe a couple hundred.
Yeah.
But
Camille's part of a really large church.
We're like 15,000 members,
Yeah.
with 2 services. So
I'm guessing that may not be the situation that many of you all, the rest of you all are. So, yeah. Typically we see.
but there's still the possibility of renting from a neighbor business that's closed on Sundays.
Yep, that's right. That's right. Yep.
Yeah. So, it's interesting, Mary, you're asking the question again about a church in a single family neighborhood. And that's, again, it's all about relationships. And, if your city allows parking on the street, sometimes there's some real fighting over those spaces. Here in Pasadena, they don't even allow any parking on the street at all at night. And so it's every city is going to have their own battles. And so I think when we get deeper into the deals and negotiating and thinking through your neighborhood and what your issues are, that's when we'll really identify what needs to be considered, but yeah, it's all about relationships. So, well, if there's not other questions, we're going to wind down here. And we have some questions that are also on your intake form. And we want to make sure that you're filling that out. Lucero, I believe you sent that again, right, to everyone, the intake forms.
Margaret put it on the.
Margaret put those to everyone. So if you hopefully you've had a chance to fill those out. But I believe Bill and Maura will be leading you in a series of questions to think about. If you're comfortable talking about some of this, it might encourage other churches. So if you're not, that's okay too. But Phil, do you have those questions handy?
Hang on a second. Well, one of the questions that we wanted to ask, do any of you have a strong sense of how you want to utilize a ground use payment that would come to the church? Hopefully we've cleared up that it's not necessary to donate your land. Not to dissuade you if you really want to do that, but assuming that you are going to receive some economic consideration, do you have a sense of how you would use it?
So a point of clarification there. So I heard you say lump sum. So it's possible to get a lump sum and then get a monthly or quarterly or annual payment as well, or
Yeah, it's,
or is it lump
Right.
sum?
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
think that's your question for you.
yeah, yes is the answer. You know, sometimes there's circumstances where it's a combination of lump sum in monthly or annually or quarterly, or it's just annually, or it's just, quarterly. It really, we push for one lump sum, but there are times that the project, for whatever reason, needs to pay some on the back end as well.
Can those funds be used to finance the parking lot? Especially in the case of
Yes.
Yes.
okay.
So the example that I showed you, even with that church that was saying, they had a $10 million wish list, basically, and $2.5 million of that is parking. Even if they get all that, they'll still come out ahead because their ground lease is going to be more than $10 million. Right. So it's just going to reduce that value, reduce that cash that they get.
So I guess we're back to your question now, Phil.
Yeah. So I think there's different ways, obviously, that you can be paid with a ground lease, but the question now is kind of how do you want to use that money? And that was a really good suggestion to go toward more parking. We have another church that's looking at buying back some of those units to make sure they have the control of those units and can rent them to people they want. Other churches that I know are wanting to use it for historical preservation. They've got some beautiful historical resources. It's very expensive to keep stained glass windows in good shape. Very expensive to fix. So if you've had a chance to think through maybe some of the ways that you might want to use those ground lease payments and funds, there's another church that's actually going to take and use that to rebuild their church. They decided to wipe out the church and start fresh. And so they're going to create a smaller church and a smaller footprint. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, I think there's some other questions that you have, Bill.
Anyone else? Of course, the most common thing to do with the lump sum is to put in an investment account, right? And use the income that's generated to subsidize the operations of the church. And we know that for many congregations, would venture to guess, many of you, that's probably needed. At the same time, it doesn't absolve a congregation from actually needing to look at its long-term kind of operating picture, and whether the its annual budget that it has in terms of expenditures is really sustainable and geared to the right needs of the church. So while we do encourage that for operating support, and we understand that tithes and offerings are really, it's not like it used to be 50 years ago, right? Where everything would be paid out of tithes and offerings. Many churches really do have to diversify their income stream, but it's not something that should sort of, stop those other conversations from happening, and making sure that
Hopefully that money would go toward ministry. There may be dreams that you have if you're close to school of having an after school program, and you may want to hire staff to do that and utilize the church building in some interesting ways of reaching out in love to the community. You know, there may be a community room in the new development, and you would have some opportunity there. You know, there's a lot of ways where you need to get clear on what your vision is for ministry and how to best use those funds, and how God wants you to use those funds. So as you're thinking through on your intake form, really ask God to show you how you should best use those funds. We want to wind down here. Our time is coming to a close, and I want to make sure we understand where we're going to be meeting in our final session. We're meeting in person, just like we did on the first day. And with us will be those that are also part of the apprenticeship program that are on the Zoom call with us today. It's going to be here in Pasadena at the Pasadena Housing Department. They have a community room right next to the housing department, and they're in a very interesting part of the city of Pasadena. And I think it's really cool that the housing department meets at a shopping center, and they're upstairs in a shopping center. And I want to make sure I get the I'm going to do a share here so you can see that little map. So so this is just north of the freeway, the 210 freeway, which you would be taking to get to Pasadena. And you can see there's a major road here, Orange Grove. And so in the big white area, you can see where my cursor is. That's called the Vallarta Market. And up above, right next to the market, this red roof, kind of orangey roof, that's right where the housing department is. And so you can park in the parking lot in the shopping center. We'll have signs, but you're right next to the Blaze Pizza in the Vallarta. From Blaze Pizza, you're to the right of that. If you're inside having pizza and you go out the door and you turn right, and there's the door. It's a double door. Go up to the second floor, and that's where we're going to be in their community room. If you go down the hall, it's on the right. I'm also putting in the chat for you all the address, and we'll be sending it as well so that you can make sure you get that into your GPS when you come. It will be starting at 9 in the morning and go until noon. We gave you some maps. This is what it looks like. There you go. Thank you. So, so make sure you get there on time so we can make full use of our time together. That morning, you'll be learning more about the RFP, the request for proposals. What we put all this together into a proposal that is then pitched to potential affordable housing developers. So Phil will be sharing this with us initially about that. And then we have some architects, including, you know, and urban planners and Andre White and Phil and Hugh Martinez on our team will be circulating. So those large maps that we made for you will be going table by table and helping you imagine all different configurations and ways and scenarios that you might want to consider, just to give you enough tools to start thinking about how this all might come together and work for you. So so that's pretty much it for today, unless you have other questions. And then I'd like us to close
The
out in
address
prayer.
again?
Yeah, I put it in chat. Did you see it? And I can also verbally say it. It's just a second. The address is 649 North Fair Oaks, and it's the second floor, room 203. There
Thank
you
you.
go. Yeah. So thank you for that question.
And Jill, did you want to share anything about those of us that are coming in from out of town?
Yeah, by email, I've been giving you quite a few
Okay.
instructions. Yeah,
All
so 3 of you are flying in on Friday. And so Camelia will be helping to pick you up. I'll probably be there too, but we're working out some details on that. And then there's a whole program that's outlined for you that just read your emails carefully. If I don't have your email, make sure I get that from you so that I can send it to you. So, so I'd like us to close out in prayer, and I'd love to have someone volunteer to pray and thank God for our time together today. So we've got plenty of pastors here on the call today with us. So if you have, if you would like to thank God for our time and pray for us, we'd greatly appreciate that. So. Just looking through here to see. Yeah, okay, great. So I know, are you still on the call, Pastor Martha Morales?
I'm here.
Would you please pray for us today? Thank you so much.
Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this time together, for the wonderful wisdom and expertise that have been shared with us as our various congregations consider how we can use our properties for the good of our neighbors and for the good of your community, your world community. We're so grateful for all the ways in which we are being supported through this process. And we pray that all of this wisdom might be brought to bear as we begin to narrow down our options and our possibilities, that we might make a really wonderful decision, both for our congregations and for our communities and for our state and beyond. We're grateful for this opportunity, and we give you thanks in the name and spirit of your love and peace in our world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. So, if you have a few extra questions, especially if you're part of the apprenticeship, we can stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions on that. And